So obviously, the last 2 weeks, we've observed the building of Gideon's character and confidence and faith in God, right? And God used Gideon and his undersized army to overcome the mass number of Midianites, right? Seems like such a great ending to such a great story, and I really wish it just stopped right there. But because, as is often the case, self-centered, egotistical pride of a human can send a faithful man into a downward spiral toward destruction. Sadly, Gideon is no exception. And I will say, he is in the hall of faith that is mentioned in Hebrews. So there is a testament of his growth and character and process. But today we're talking about not just starting well, but ending well, okay? I'm going to read some of the scripture and then I'll summarize some of it, just so you know. But most of the insights and stuff I'm going to cover today on your outline are going to be at the end, okay? So we're going to kind of finish the story off here. So I mentioned last week at the end of this battle that they didn't really fight, remember? They were just being noisy. God did all of it. So Gideon invited the northern tribe of Ephraim to help track down the Midianites that had fled and escaped after fighting each other, okay? So Ephraim happily responded, and they ended up capturing 2 Midianite princes, killed them, and they presented their heads to Gideon, okay? So that was the ending of last week, chapter 7. So Ephraim was the largest and most powerful tribe of the Israelites at that time. And they had mighty-sized egos to go with it. So after gifting the prince's remains to Gideon, we kick off Judges chapter 8. And here's what the men of Ephraim said. Verse 1. Then the people of Ephraim asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us this way?" Remember, they just had this victory, right? "Why have you treated us this way? Why didn't you send for us when you first went out to fight the Midianites?" And they argued heatedly with Gideon. So this is their response to getting invited to this victory and having a part in it. They're angry. And when it says they argued heatedly, that means they were forcefully and severely reprimanding Gideon because they missed out on the beginning of the fight. They missed out on that victory. So jealousy was rearing its ugly head, right? And instead of being excited that their fellow people were now free, they were envious that they didn't get to flex their muscles in the fight. Remember, they were the largest, most powerful tribe. Why wouldn't you call on us? Okay, so this is the opposition that Gideon faces immediately after this victory, okay? So Gideon responds to their hateful criticism very diplomatically. In verses 2 and 3, he basically says, "Are you crazy? You caught and killed the princes. You got the trophy, the best part. You know, your one tribe of men did more than all of us did, the 300 of us did to begin with," right? So he's appeasing their ego, okay? So notice Gideon didn't challenge that pride. Instead, he soothed their wounded egos, right? He applauded their achievement, gave them the recognition that they were craving, and it worked. It tells us that their anger faded. So what Gideon appears to be making good leadership decisions right here, right? Striving for unity amongst the nation. But I'm going to explain a little later why that may not be the case, okay? So let's go on to verse 4, continue the story. Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men, and though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. So at this point, 2 princes are out of the way, but the kings of Midian had still survived, and they were at large with the remaining of the Midianite army, their people. So Gideon and his men travel approximately 20 miles at this point away from that battle to try to capture the remaining ones, okay? So verse 5, when they reached Succoth, Gideon asked the leaders of the town, "Please give my warriors some food. They are very tired. I'm chasing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." Verse 6, but the officials of Succoth replied, "Well, catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your army." In other words, those kings may defeat you. So we're going to wait and see who comes out on top. Just choose whose side we're going to be on. Okay. So verse 7, Gideon said, after the Lord gives me the victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns of briars from the wilderness. Very ruthless, right? From there, Gideon went up to Peniel and again asked for food, but he got the same answer. So he said to the people of Peniel, after I return in victory, I will tear down this tower. So one tribe wanted in from the beginning to get the credit, right? While others stayed out until they could benefit from the victory of whoever came out on top. This is the vast differentiation of the tribes of Israel at this point. So these are all tribes, the different tribes of Israel that Gideon is asking to help them. And he isn't even asking them to fight. He's just asking for food for those of us on the front lines, right? But this shows how divided Israel was at that time, refused by his own people. And isn't that often the case? I could have made it insight into this, but I'm just going to make a comment. When we set out to do God's work, the resistance we face is often from those that we are closest to, right? They know us. They know the insides of us, the ins and outs of us. They probably knew Gideon was a cheerful or a fearful chicken at some point. So they were playing on that part of his character, right? But another good reason that we need to stay alert, as we talked about last week. Sometimes the enemy is in our own camp, right? Anyway, let's focus on Gideon's reaction when he was denied. So he had a gentle response toward the jealous men of Ephraim, right? But a harsh anger for those more complacent to refuse to assist. Not once, but twice. He really harshly responded. What happened to this feeble man who was once hiding just to thresh wheat in the most ineffective, inadequate way? He went from literally being a timid person to a tyrant leader, seemingly overnight, right? So God's word says, the words we speak come from our heart, right? We've talked about that. If Gideon's heart here is so vicious and self-serving, could it be that his words toward the Ephraim men were equally egotistical? Both challenged his leadership, his decision-making, right? But it wouldn't benefit him to take off the largest, most powerful tribe of Israel. It will serve him better to keep them happy, right? But it will also serve him well to seek personal revenge on those who dare question his ability to finish the job, which is exactly what happened, okay? So let's continue. I'll get more on that in a little bit too. The next 7 verses basically reveal that they're the 120 Midianites that died in battle, right? And after threatening these 2 towns, Gideon discovers the whereabouts of the 15,000 remaining men who were alive and where they were, and they were hiding out along with their 2 kings, okay? So he discovers where they all are, and he orchestrates another surprise attack and captures all of them, kings and the 15,000 that remained. And on his way back from that battle, Gideon apprehended a young man that he had come across as they're walking over this pass to get back, a young man from Succoth. Remember, that's the first town that denied to help him. So he apprehends this man and demanded he write down the names of 77 officials and elders of his town. Okay. Then he returned to Succoth with the Midianite kings in tow and essentially says, look, I've caught the kings. Here's my prize. Here's what you thought I couldn't do. Despite your incredulous doubt, I did it. And then he gathered the elders of the town that had been written down and publicly beat them as he had threatened to do. But his rampage doesn't stop there. He moves on to Peniel, the second town that denied him. He tears down the tower just as he threatened. And it says in scripture that he kills all the men in that town. Suddenly, he is not full of God's glory. He is full of a personal rage. Okay? Now, after doing this, he turns his attention on the Midianite kings and he confronts them. And what happens is he elicits this confession, making them confess that they personally had killed Gideon's brothers, okay? And upon hearing this confession, Gideon turns to his oldest son and tells him to kill the kings. So he calls on his oldest son, watching him, you go kill the kings. Well, his son was still only a young boy and was afraid and couldn't even bear the strength or energy or the courage to draw a sword. The kings see this, and the kings tell Gideon, so they're taunting him, you be a man, kill us yourself. And with that challenge to his ego, he slayed both the kings. So much violence right here for a man once afraid to thresh wheat out in the open, right? So much brutality for a man that did absolutely no fighting in the original battle, remember? Okay. It's interesting because some scholars will actually praise his leadership at that point, his take charge attitude. But others disagree. Have you noticed that so far in chapter 8, if you were to read through all of chapter 8, there is no longer any definitive indication that God is involved in Gideon's actions. God spoke throughout Judges 6. He continued throughout Judges 7. Suddenly, after that victory was done, there is no mention of thus saith the Lord guiding Gideon anymore. It appears the confidence that he built transferred from God onto his own abilities from that powerful victory. Okay. In light of that fact, let's talk about this confession that Gideon forces out of the kings. Okay. So this interaction with the kings is a significant factor regarding the state of Gideon's heart and mind at this point. It would make sense that the kings needed to be killed and they would be expected to die as a battle, get rid of all the Midianites. No mercy, no survivors, right? God would have them all conquered, none of them left. But this encounter that we read about here before the execution of the kings is no longer about a nation being freed from the heavy-handed evil of the Midianites. We know and see through scripture that Gideon makes this personal, okay? They were most likely killed, his brothers, that the kings confessed to killing, did not die on the battlefield. His brothers that he is making these kings confess to killing died during a time of peace. So they were most likely killed at home or in the field during one of the Midianite raids on their camps and on their crops and on their livestock. Okay? Before God called Gideon. So Gideon wants revenge for his brother's bloodshed, as was the ancient custom. Eye for an eye, okay? Seems like it makes sense. However, if you understand lex talionis, which is the law of exact retribution, where the eye for an eye comes from, right? You have to understand he's no longer rescuing Israel and the nation from the Midianites. He's full on retaliating for something personally that happened before, okay? And he uses this law of exact retribution, but he doesn't do it within the parameters that the nation of Israel set in place. So you have to understand that this law was intended to be a national law, not a personal endeavor. It was to be done through the legal court system. There was a process. It was meant to be a deterrent to a crime, right? And it was a law to limit vengeance, which was the very thing that Gideon was doing. So suddenly, in this encounter with the kings, he makes himself judge, jury, and executioner, ignoring the legal process. Again, he was a judge, so he's rewriting the law. He's making it personal to benefit him. So by causing them to make this public confession, He's putting himself above the law because that should not have been done by the person that was the offender or the offended to the offender. There had to be a mediator, and he went above and beyond that, okay? And yet, because of what the Israelites who are witnessing this, they see, they realize he's become this impressive force to be reckoned with, right? Within the eyes of all of the Israelites. So much so, after these encounters that they see, they want to make Gideon king. Verse 22 and 23. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers. For you, notice this, you have rescued us from Midian. But Gideon replied, verse 23, I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. Notice that Gideon never verbally corrects them when they credited him with defeating the Midianites instead of God. Oversight? Or maybe subtle acceptance? Subtly accepting what their statement was as a belief in his own heart that he did do it. See, a neglect to defer credit for that victory back to God was in a way him taking the credit. Okay? And even though he gives the right answer about becoming king and he declines their request and says God will rule over you, which we will come back to that statement in a second, it didn't stop him from acting like a king. Because when you read the next verse, he says, no, my sons, we're not going to rule over you. God will rule over you. But verse 24, however, I do have one request. That each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies. That sounds an awful lot like a tax, doesn't it? You earned all this, but let me have part of it. Okay? I don't want to be king, but let me collect some gains from each of you so that I can act like a king. But the people, verse 25, they gladly, they replied. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw in a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants and the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. So he had all of this from the kings that he had gotten off their bodies and their camels. All of that added up to about 50 pounds of gold. I don't want the responsibility, but I will gladly accept the benefits of acting like your king. Since you are so gullible and so willing, I'm going to make sure I take advantage of that. So this act financially lifted him above the level of the people he was to lead. And it was at their expense that he gained all of that. Okay, so that's a serious character issue, right? Coming from someone who had been victimized by the Midianites himself. He's now victimizing the people that he's trying to lead. Then, as if that wasn't enough, verse 27, Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold, and he put it in Ophrah, remember his hometown. But soon, all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, this ephod, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. It became their new idol. So an ephod. It was like this apron-like garment that was worn by high priests. Only high priests, right? It held 12 stones as the breastplate. It was very shiny, very heavy. And those 12 stones represented the 12 tribes of Israel, right? It also held these two flat stones that were tucked in behind, called Urim and Thummim. Urim and Thummim. And those two flat stones were secured in pockets. And when the priest would pull them out and expose them, that was what they were utilizing to discern the will of God as a high priest. Okay, so there was something in the stones and the way the light played off of them. I couldn't find a good detailed version of what that meant, but somehow the light factors, where the priests were encouraged to lay them and how they played off the lights and everything, led them to discern the will of God, okay? So Gideon makes an ephod, but he's not a Levite, remember? Who are supposed to be the high priest? The Levites. Scholars say that it's actually possible after being so built up by God himself. It was rare that God spoke directly to people, right? Scholars say that his encounters with God himself and God divinely demonstrating through his own life in such a personal way, he now thought that he could relate to God on his own terms. So he would make these new methods and God would adjust to his. Okay. One author wrote this: Gideon had become so addicted to hearing God that he prioritized hearing God over God himself. So instead of needing to go to the temple or the high priest to discern the will of God, he made it more convenient and personal. That's why he made the ephod. Okay. It's also worth mentioning that scholars say that this ephod was to be a rival place of worship to compete against who? The Ephraim people. Because those whiners, remember, that didn't get invited to the battle, that Gideon so smoothly soothed over. At that time, the center of worship for Israel was in their territory. It appears that their prestige and influence got under his skin more than he let on. He didn't want to need access to their land. He wanted to make it his own. I don't need you. I got this myself, okay? All that to say, go back to, he said, even though Gideon said, God will rule over you, he created an idol in the form of the ephod that led him and the whole nation away from the one true God. He led them away from him ruling over them. Verse 28, that is the story of how the people of Israel defeated Midian, which never recovered. So the Midianites never recovered in that time frame. Throughout the rest of Gideon's lifetime, about 40 years, there was peace in the land, okay? So Gideon returns home to Ophrah. He has 70 sons with his harem, his many wives. And you need to understand that a harem at that time was an explicit attempt to boast of your wealth. It was like saying, look at all the wives and the children that I can support. And it was Gideon's way of showing off what his strengths and abilities and power over the Israelites had landed him, okay? And he had a mistress on the side of the 70 wives. That wasn't enough. So he had this mistress on the side who gave birth to a son that Gideon named Abimelech. Do you know what the name in Hebrew Abimelech means? It means my father is king. Gideon dies in his old age, believing that he was their king. Even though he said, I will not be your king, he acted like he was their king, which goes to show you, you can be humble in your words, but your heart is not a reflection of what you truly believe. So Gideon dies in his old age. Israel immediately returned to worshiping the images of Baal, forgetting the God who rescued them from all of their surrounding enemies. And their loyalty to Gideon even died with Gideon. We won't go into it, but if you go into Judges chapter 9, you will see the loyalty of the Israelites to Gideon and his family died when Gideon died as well. So Gideon began really well, but finished really poorly. He ended in pride, he ended in idolatry, and once again, we see the nation of Israelites being taken back down with a leader who could not keep the ego at bay, okay? But I wanted to note this. I mentioned this either I think it was the first or second week, I don't remember, but remember how after Gideon tore down the Baal tower in their backyard, his dad's backyard, the people called him Jerubbaal, and it was a pagan given name. In Judges chapter 9, if you read the whole chapter in Hebrew, Gideon's name is not used. Instead, it exclusively uses the pagan name that he was given, Jerubbaal. And the name of God is not used either. In Judges 9, instead of Yahweh, it uses Elohim, which is a generic name for God. It could be a small g God. That's how far Gideon fell from being the person of humility that God called, and how far he led the Israelites away from the one true God. He was no longer recognized as a faithful follower of God. He was recognized as the man who tore down Baal's altar. And God was no longer mentioned throughout Israel. So the heritage that Gideon left behind was no better with his family. If you looked at the influence of Abimelech, who, remember, was not his wives, but his mistress, he should have never had access to leadership. He became a murderous tyrant and forced his way to lead over Israel for a time after this. All that to say, that is the person that Abimelech witnessed, and that is the person that he became. Okay? So we use Gideon's story a lot to talk about how God takes someone weak and unlikely to accomplish great things. And that is so true. And there's such a ton of good things to learn from the early process of Gideon's journey. But if we don't learn from the ending process, we risk falling into that same pattern as humans. Somewhere after that initial victory, it seems Gideon's newfound strength actually would cripple him. Okay? Why? Simply put, and I've used this phrase before, Gideon did not guard his strengths. I've quoted Oswald Chambers before. Unguarded strength is a double weakness. That is what happened in Gideon's life. He didn't guard the newfound strengths, the newfound responsibilities. Okay? And this aligns with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:12. He says, if you think you're standing strong, be careful not to fall. So we guard ourselves when we know we're weak. Gideon guarded himself a whole lot at that beginning because he knew and was aware of his weaknesses. But he left his strengths wide open. When he became confident in himself is when he started the massive decay in the spiral downward, okay? So insight 1, and we're going to pitch through these really quickly here at the end. When left unguarded, our strengths can become an obstacle to our spiritual growth and cripple the effectiveness of our walk with God. So I'm going to be more practical than I have been for a while. I want to close today and summarize some lessons learned from Gideon, the whole story regarding unguarded strengths. So let's start with some pitfalls when strength is left unguarded, okay? Number 1, an unguarded strength makes us independent of God. We see that throughout Gideon's story. We've talked about God desiring that dependence, right? I don't need to spend a ton of time on this. Simply remember that God desires us to be dependent on him. But unguarded strength says, I'll use my strengths my way because I feel good about this, right? But guarded strengths will surrender them for the good of building God's kingdom and portraying God's character. That seems to be what Gideon did not do once that first victory and the battle was over, right? He acted independently from God. Number 2, unguarded strengths make us intolerant. He was not tolerant of those people denying him assistance, right? But did the absence of the town's assistance, would that have kept Gideon and his men from accomplishing the task that God had already promised? To finish off the Midianites? It didn't matter. He didn't get their help, but he still accomplished what God asked him to do. And Gideon didn't just use his strength there, he unleashed it. because he couldn't tolerate their doubt and their rejection. Okay? Irritation with others who aren't where we think they are comes from a place of arrogance and pride, right? Proverbs 13:10 says, arrogance leads to nothing but strife. That's exactly what happened with Gideon. The first task, remember, God gave Gideon was to tear down the altar to Baal. And he did it at night when no one was looking because he was afraid. But now he's making others fear him because they're questioning his identity. They're questioning his authority. God had such tolerance and patience for his process, but he had none to give anybody else when he was operating in his own strength, right? Finding too much value in his own strength, he took it personally and he set out to prove himself, leading to conflict. So question, do we hold grudges and resentment toward those who challenge our giftings or abilities or may not see the value of our strength? Are we offended by a lack of recognition? If so, we may be walking in unguarded strength. Insight 2, unguarded strength justifies a fight to prove or defend ourselves. But guarded strength says my value is not in what I can do, but who I belong to. Leviticus 26:19 says, I will break down your strong pride. God says, I'm going to break it down at some way, some shape, somehow. So if you don't want God to humble you, then we have to take the responsibility to walk in humility ourselves as a choice, right? Gideon could have had a legacy of faith that he passed on to his family. Instead, he died and there was no loyalty left to him or his family because of the way he did not guard his strengths. Okay. So let me finalize this by offering some suggestions on how to guard your strengths based on lessons that we've already learned. Okay. So some of this is a summary. Number 1, go beyond your abilities. Don't settle for what you can do. Gideon's army went from 32,000 to 300, from 4-to-1 ratio to 450-to-1 ratio. Again, if you've got this because of your abilities, then God may be saying it's time to take it up a notch, and not so that you're not acting on your own abilities. You're not acting on your own strength. He makes us aware of our strengths, and he gives us these giftings and abilities so that we know the unique way in which we are designed to partner with him, not exclusive of him. So question, how can you position yourself where personal strength is insufficient and dependence on God is required to accomplish the goal? Maybe it's time to set new goals, not be complacent with what comes naturally, what comes easily. If you want to guard those gifts and the strengths you've been given, push them beyond what you're capable of doing. Number 2, grow in character more than strength. Insight 3 follows that right behind it. Never let your strengths take you where your character cannot sustain you. If pride goes before the fall, as we've talked about, it's not like you all of a sudden trip over this brick. Oh, didn't see that coming, right? It starts subtle. A subtle deflection of saying, oh, God won this victory, not me. A subtle attempt or a subtle acceptance of what they believed, that he had already really started to believe in his heart, right? His character went from here to, ooh, here we go back down again, because he didn't guard his strengths. His character couldn't sustain the victories that God had given him. So subtle, if it starts subtle, here's a few examples. This is where I start getting convicted, and I'm not going to look at anybody in the eye because this is about me, and maybe you can relate. A wrongful thought left unchecked, a subtlety, right? I could have done that better. Man, I rocked that. I feel really good about myself and what just happened and what I did. They should have listened to me. I told them. I knew I was going to go this way. I should just do it so it gets done right. These initial subtle thoughts are signs of a character being built on our own abilities, right? And there's never a more important time to grow in character than after experiencing a victory, right? Gideon's meager army was never a threat to God's plan. That was God's plan all along. But his oversized heart and view of himself threatened the Israelites and the nation of Israel and led them back into idolatry, right back where they started. I have two scholar quotes on this. One was, Gideon was remarkably obedient and filled with faith in the extreme moment of battle. The routine and daily living seems to have been a greater test of his character. This is true for many, and the challenges of daily living are more difficult than those of the extreme moment. Another scholar said, we could say that Gideon handled adversity better than success. Successes, riches, and prominence brought him down. Why? Because his character was not grown to the place where it could sustain him in the success. He didn't guard it. Number 3, we talked about this, but I'm going to hit it a little more specifically as a way to guard our strength, and that's stay alert. Remember, we talked about that last week, staying alert to your surroundings. That was a test from God. Stay alert to your thoughts about yourself, about your strengths. And I'm going to be personal. One of my strengths, as according to Strength Finders, which is a book and a test that you take, my top number 1 strength was responsibility. I'm a very responsible person. But left unguarded, I will take on responsibilities of others overcommit. Left unguarded, my responsible strength may cause me to sacrifice family and friends or my own health because I have to do this or no one else will, right? That's me. That's personal. Here's a couple of examples. If your strength is endurance, be alert to when God says stop. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Keep going. If your strength is getting tasks done, that organization, be alert so you don't go ahead of God or trample on others in the process who aren't keeping up with you. If compassion or mercy is your gifting and your strength, be alert to if you develop a savior complex. Yeah, they came to me because they knew I would just love on them. Subtle. If your strength is having a charming personality, there can be a fine line that crosses over to manipulation if left unguarded. One more. If your strength is a positive outlook, you may not be aware when someone just needs to mourn in the yuck and not find a silver lining in the cloud or not have to look at the bright side, right? You get the point, right? Every strength has an opportunity to go beyond in an unhealthy way, right? So question, what unhealthy behaviors do you risk participating in if your strength, your particular strength, remains unguarded? Number 4, last one, remain teachable. Insight number 4, following right under that, strength is unguarded when we don't partner with the belief that there's always more to learn. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, it says, wisdom is better than strength. but one sinner destroys much good. And that's basically saying if I'm operating outside of wisdom and strength, there's a lot that can be destroyed around me and in me as a result. So we need to always make room for God to teach us what we think we already know. Remain teachable in the very thing you think you already know how to do. And I'm going to end with this question, and we're going to go into communion before we worship. What are specific things you can do to guard your strengths and giftings so that you end better than you started?